Why do highly resourced, perfectly funded projects routinely collapse, while penniless operators, constrained by every possible metric, manage to build empires? In 1937, a researcher named Napoleon Hill published an exhaustive attempt to answer this exact question. He spent decades reverse engineering the psychology of high performers to find a reproducible mechanism for achievement. He formulated his heuristics during a period of extreme systemic friction, the Great Depression. Traditional capital had vanished, forcing operators to rely entirely on cognitive resources. Hill analyzed the outliers who thrived in this environment, searching for the precise variables that separated them from the broader population. He concluded with a bedrock axiom: thoughts are things. Hill did not view thought as abstract mysticism. He classified it as a literal form of potential kinetic energy. This equation models his premise. An intangible idea remains completely inert unless it is compounded by three specific variables: definiteness of purpose, burning desire, and persistence. When applied sequentially, these variables create a measurable force capable of altering physical and economic realities. We can test the validity of this equation by measuring it against two extreme historical data points recorded in Hill's text. We will look at the absolute, unconditional commitment of an operator named Edwin C. Barnes and contrast it against the conditional commitment of a gold miner named R.U. Darby. The data reveals that material wealth is not dictated by initial physical capital, but by a highly specific mathematical application of cognitive endurance. Methodical. The first data point centers on Edwin C. Barnes. He arrived at Thomas Edison's laboratory with zero financial capital, zero influence, and looking like a tramp. He was attempting to penetrate a massive institutional power dynamic. Edison was the most famous inventor on Earth, operating a heavily fortified industrial complex. Barnes made a crucial cognitive distinction before he arrived. He did not travel there to ask for a job working for Edison. He demanded a partnership with Edison. Unable to access the central hub directly, Barnes accepted a minimum wage clerk position to get inside the environment. The opening arrived when Edison invented the Ediphone, a device his standard sales force rejected as unsellable. The existing network saw a failure. Barnes recognized a systemic gap he could exploit. He seized the discarded product, formulated a highly targeted distribution plan, and bypassed the traditional hierarchy entirely to execute the sales himself. Barnes successfully built a massive national distribution network under a single slogan, made by Edison and installed by Barnes. Years later, Edison analyzed the event. He noted that it was not Barnes's physical appearance or initial resources that secured the partnership. It was the unyielding, definitive nature of his thought that forced the outcome. The Barnes paradigm proves that systemic friction is not a barrier. It is merely the necessary entry fee required to access a central hub of power. We contrast Barnes with a heavily resourced operation, R.U. Darby's uncle during the gold rush. He started with significant advantages. He invested heavy capital, purchased expensive industrial machinery, and rapidly struck a lucrative vein of gold ore. Then, the critical friction point hit. The gold vein suddenly disappeared. The expensive machinery began pulling up nothing but empty dirt. Darby's uncle made a fatal cognitive error. He interpreted this sudden geological friction as a terminal failure of the entire enterprise. He capitulated immediately. He liquidated his heavily invested machinery to a local junkman for a few $100s and abandoned the site. This cross-section illustrates the junkman's crucial variable. He hired a mining engineer who understood geological fault lines. The engineer calculated that the fault line merely displaced the vein. The main source of gold continued exactly 3 feet away. The junkman extracted millions of dollars in wealth simply because he applied expert knowledge to a temporary obstacle. Hill categorized this behavioral flaw as quitability, the habit of retreating the moment an operation encounters temporary defeat. Failure operates as a trickster. It introduces the highest level of friction precisely when success is within physical reach. The Darby paradox highlights the danger of an unconditioned mind, the tendency to mistake a temporary systemic pause for a definitive permanent end. Henry Ford represents the ultimate synthesis of Hill's equation. He built his empire by actively engineering against expert consensus. Ford issued a radical mandate to his engineering team: design and cast a V8 engine entirely within a single solid block of metal. The technical pushback was immediate. His engineers evaluated the request and categorically declared the design to be physically impossible. Ford gave an unyielding directive: produce it anyway. He ordered them to stay on the job until the problem was solved, regardless of how much time or capital it required. 6 months passed with no results. Then another 6 months went by. The foundry floor saw repeated, costly failures. The psychological toll on the engineers was massive. They were trapped between the established laws of physics and Ford's absolute definiteness of purpose. After 12 months of sustained persistence, the engineering barrier was inexplicably breached. They successfully cast the single-block V8. The resulting industrial output dominated the market. Ford forced a physical reality into existence through sheer cognitive stamina. He succeeded because he understood a higher law of operations. The variables of persistence and desire actively outrank current technical consensus. Barnes, Darby, and Ford all highlight the same primary barrier. Translating an idea into wealth requires the ability to distinguish temporary defeat from permanent failure. This split screen models behavioral divergence. On the left, failure consciousness accepts sudden friction as a permanent reality. On the right, success consciousness views friction merely as a toll paid on the path to the objective. Hill's fundamental operating principle requires the mind to be aggressively reconditioned to view every single defeat as strictly temporary. To execute this framework, one must follow a literal directive: remove the word impossible from your mental dictionary. Thought, multiplied by definite purpose, raised to the power of persistence. Riches come rapidly and in abundance only when the mind overrides external consensus, applies the equation, and sustains effort past the threshold of initial failure.